Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, join Joe Grabowski and I as we interview Brian Holdsworth, a Catholic YouTuber and apologist and fellow Chestertonian. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your host, and joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Joe Grabowski. Hi there, Joe. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Great, and we are so happy today to be joined by Brian Holdsworth. How are you today, Brian?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm a little bit under the weather, so my voice sounds a little more masculine than it normally does. So, but otherwise, I'm doing well, thanks.
Just lean in. You know, they say that G.K. Chesterton had a very high voice. So
did he really? Wow,
yeah,
I never would have expected that.
Yeah, apparently it was quite unexpected coming from such a man.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of my audiobooks that I have, it might be The Everlasting Man, but the narrator sounds like Churchill, like just this very pronounced characteristic, like. Just strong character in the accent and very low and kind of curmudgeon-y sounding. And for some reason, I've always just assumed that's what Chesterton sounded like.
No, we have a few.
Like
yeah, we have a couple recordings. I think they're mostly radio interviews, but he's sort of like, what does just Shakespeare say? Pipes and whistles in his sound, kind of high voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you ask me to sing, my voice will probably become very falsetto and squeaky. So I won't do that.
No worries. Anyway, it's just great to have you. For our listeners who don't know who you are, would you mind just giving a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a Catholic convert. I live in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which most people have no idea where that is, but it's very, very far north. It's our leaves have finally just bloomed, so we get about 3 months of leaves on trees, just to give you sort of an impression of the climate up here. I am married, and we have 7.5 children, depending on how you count imminent deliveries.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And I work in, let's say, communications, marketing, branding, that kind of thing. So I'm a creative communications person who started a YouTube channel mostly for professional reasons and didn't even really know what I was going to be talking about. But it was more a proof of concept to show competent communicators, the kinds of people who sit in front of the camera, a proof of concept for what we can do production wise. And then it just took on a life of its own. And so ever since then, I've become something of a public personality in the life of the church. And Chesterton is someone who I take much inspiration from.
Wonderful. So when did you meet Chesterton? When did that happen?
Okay. Yeah. So that would have been around 2007, 2008, something like that. It was shortly after we were married. And the Archdiocese here put on an event called the C.S. Lewis Symposium. And this was around the time, if you want to figure out the date, it's just whenever the Narnia movies first came out, the first Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I think they were trying to capitalize on the interest that the movies were generating. And so they wanted to do kind of an evangelistic, but also intellectual type event to promote the faith and to catechize, mostly because our Archbishop at the time was a very literary person, Cardinal Archbishop Collins, who is now the emeritus Archbishop of Toronto. So it was very much his influence that shaped that event, and it wasn't well attended though at the time, I remember. And it was mostly the usual suspects, the kinds of people who come out to every church event, right? And he seemed somewhat downcast after the end. Oh, and maybe I should mention that Joseph Pierce was the keynote speaker for it, who they had brought up. Yeah, and so it was full of wit and charm and wisdom and anecdotes and anything you'd want to learn about sort of that English literary tradition. And of course, Chesterton was smuggled in there all the time because it's Joseph Pierce.
Right.
But, not many people came. And the Archbishop looked kind of downcast, and I was a new convert at the time, and so I wasn't very assertive as a Catholic. I didn't really try to put myself out there, but I for whatever reason, I felt compelled to encourage him and to say at least thank you for putting on this event. That it was very edifying for me, and I learned a lot, and I hope you do it again. And that the only reason that I think maybe the attendance was low is because we don't do a very good job as a church in promoting, and let's say the marketing side of things. And since that's my profession, that's the thing that stood out to me. And I just said, we could just improve on that, but otherwise don't be discouraged. I think this was a very, very good event. And he seemed to perk up at that point, and we ended up having a very, very long conversation about our mutual love for literature and authors. And I should also maybe qualify that my interest in literature only appeared at the time of my conversion. I didn't grow up reading at all or taking any sort of extracurricular interest in literature. But my conversion inspired me to want to understand these concepts that I was wrestling with. And so I started to read, and apologetics came in because my friends and family who were not Catholic, who saw me going down this road, were trying to rescue me, trying to send out lifelines and say, "What are you doing? This is crazy." And of course, they would use arguments all the time, arguments that I hadn't thought of. And so I thought, well, I suppose maybe I should try to understand this conversion that's taking place in my life. And so I went to C.S. Lewis first, and that's what created that initial interest. And so then returning to the conversation with the Archbishop, I was expressing my mutual love of C.S. Lewis, and he said, "Well, what about Chesterton? Have you read Chesterton?" And I said, I have not heard of Chesterton until this day. And he said, "Well, you've got to read Chesterton." And I remember him talking about heretics at the time. I couldn't say what other book he had recommended at the time. And I thought, okay, well, I'll pick up a book. And I went to the local Christian bookstore, and do you have any Chesterton? Who's that? They had no idea who I was talking about, right? And if I can pause here, like this, I don't know if you guys will take credit for this, and maybe you don't deserve it, but my understanding is that the rehabilitation of G.K. Chesterton is almost entirely because of your organization. Because again, go back to this time, I did eventually find orthodoxy, and it was like it had like a Protestant pastor's forward in it because of his own particular interest in Chesterton. Like, it was very an eccentric kind of book to find, and a name to put out into a bookstore. Nobody knew who that was. And within not even a generation, he's very, very popular. He's the talk of the town. If I were to walk into any Catholic bookstore and say, "Do you have Chesterton?" They say, "Yeah, here's the wall of Chesterton," right? So I don't know if you guys deserve all the credit for that, but it seems to me that you do. And so thank you, first of all.
Sure. I mean, a lot of it's Dale Alquist, like straight just by himself. But Ignatius Press certainly had a lot to do with it. You probably know more, Joe, if there's anyone else we should be.
It really was kind of a work of the Holy Spirit, I would say, is that Chesterton was due again for rediscovery, and you see so many different elements kind of converging at one time. The Chesterton Institute at Seton Hall, Dale Alquist and his work, Aidan Mackey and Stratford Caldecott over in England. So there was this real kind of convergence of things, and kind of happening simultaneously on multiple continents, which is really fascinating too. So I chalk it up to the work of the Holy Spirit and wanting Chesterton to be the apostle of common sense in a world that had kind of lost hold of that particular value and virtue. I have to say about Cardinal Collins, just incidentally for our viewers and listeners, that he did join us at one of our previous Chesterton conferences. And celebrated Mass for us and gave the keynote address. I'll see if I can find the video and link to that here in the show notes so that you can hear from the Archbishop himself on what Chesterton had to say.
He's the kind of personality who makes you want to read, because the love of literature just flows out through him, and that was apparent in the conversation I was having with him. He kept on talking about Chesterton with this deep affection, and so I thought, okay, well, I pretty much plowed through C.S. Lewis, and so I need this next step in my progression. And so I went and found Orthodoxy. It was the only book I could find. And I admittedly really struggled with it. I like normally, so with Lewis, I would pick up a new book and I would read cover to cover. I'm not a fast reader, but over the course of a month or something like that, I'd get through a book. But Orthodoxy probably took me, and you know what? I don't even know if I finished it that first round. I really struggled with it. I was expecting C.S. Lewis 2.0, and that's not what I got at all, right? And I think that's something that people have to be prepared for with Chesterton. You hear about guys like Matt Fradd. I don't know if you guys have ever talked to him, but he had Dale Ahlquist on his show, and he admitted, I really struggle with Chesterton. And I think that's something that people need to be prepared for. And then there are ways to, if you know what you're getting into, and you know how to read Chesterton, it becomes a really fun experience. But if you're reading him the way that you would read like C.S. Lewis or any sort of standard apologetics, you're going to be maybe not disappointed, but you're going to
you might be confused.
Definitely confused, and you're going to struggle along the way. It's going to be it's not going to meet you where you want it to a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think it's important to approach Chesterton with patience, if you can, in a group. We have local societies all over the country, which you can go to our website to find them. But it's definitely one of those, and you have to, I think it's also important for people when they say, "What should I read from Chesterton?" It might be Joseph Pierce who gave me this idea, but he said, "What do you like?" So you ask people what they like, because Chesterton has such a wide range. And, for the person who you'd recommend a novel, you wouldn't recommend Orthodoxy. Like, I wouldn't want to, I'm glad I didn't start with Orthodoxy. I don't think that would have worked for me. It's definitely not C.S. Lewis 2.0, even though there's lots of parallels drawn between the two. And for good reason. What were you coming from in your conversion?
Well, so it had been a sort of a long conversion. By the time I became Catholic, I had been Christian for a few years, probably 3 years at that point. But prior to my conversion to theism, and then immediately after that Christianity, because I didn't really understand what Christianity was. I knew that Jesus was the way to God, but I didn't have this sense of incarnational Christology or the Trinity even, or what does it mean that he's the Son of God, right? Like, does that mean he's a divine person? Like, I couldn't have articulated or even understood what that means, but I suspected he was the way. But so prior to that, I was nothing really. I had been baptized at a young age in a mainline, the United Church here in Canada, which is basically the religion of woke today. Back then, I mean, you'd say liberal mainline Christianity. My parents, they split up when I was still fairly young, and my dad had actually been an atheist his entire life up until fairly recently. And so, but he didn't really push that. He wasn't sort of an obnoxious atheist. He just didn't believe himself, right? And then I think my mom associated church with civic duty almost, or what it means to be an upstanding citizen, right? Like if you're a well-to-do person, you go to church, right? And so I think those are the sensibilities that she was raised with and that she tried to maintain in our childhood, but it just didn't last because I don't think she had a supernatural faith of her own. And then the divorce, I think, dislocated her from a belonging within a Christian community. So from the time I was about 9 or 10, I would say pagan agnosticism, the wisdom of the world, the spirit of the world, was very much my sensibility. And then I had a conversion experience, and that it wasn't just a spiritual conversion; it was also an intellectual conversion, as I sort of alluded to there. And so that's what has inspired me to deep dive into just studying and understanding. Not just the things I believe, but how it came to be, the whole history of it, the history of thought around it, philosophy and theology, and getting acquainted with all the personalities that have contributed to that.
Yeah, it reminds me of, excuse me, it reminds me of something Chesterton wrote, I believe, in the Catholic Church and Conversion, where he spoke about his own conversion process and how sort of the parody of it in the world they think of conversion as when you leave off thinking, and he said it's exactly the opposite point. He said conversion is really when you begin, and you kind of learn to think again. You relearn and rediscover, and so it struck me as very significant and something that I find frequently that people, especially in conversion to Catholicism, they rediscover a love for art, for beauty, for literature, for music, painting, like all of you see it's sort of this testamentary evidence to the unity of the transcendentals, and that they are all found in God, that truth, goodness, and beauty all reside here, and they have their home. And so many converts' lives, I think, attest to that fact.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I don't know if I would have understood it in with such clarity, but certainly my intuition started to be formed in that way, where those things were starting to collide, truth, goodness, and beauty as transcendentals, and there was a longing in me to, especially in the sense of knowing it when I encountered it, right? Like when I first became Catholic, like I grew up playing the electric guitar in punk rock bands and things like that, and I was a skateboarder and really into that kind of culture, right? And I listened to really heavy music up until my conversion, and I didn't just listen to it for its aggressiveness, but because I was a guitar player, I was really immersed in let's say the cultural currents of it. Like I took pride in it, but then after my conversion, so I also played I played guitar and led the music for a Life Teen Mass because that's what I was introduced to after my conversion, right? And I thought, well, yeah, this is what gets people excited about the faith, and they seem to really enjoy it. We had like standing room only at that Mass. People were coming from all over the city and we were told from a lot of the feedback we got, it was because of the music. And I will say, although I'm not a champion of praise and worship, insofar as whatever merit there is in that, we were a good musical ensemble. But then on our honeymoon, we did a little tour of Western Europe, and our first we first landed in London and just went walking around and came across Westminster Cathedral just a few blocks from our hotel. I didn't know if it was an Anglican church or what it was, but I was like, well, in my experience of going to Europe, you just walk into these buildings, right? And so that's what we did. And sure enough, it was a Catholic church. And so Mass was starting shortly. And so we stuck around. And they have this world-class choir and organ team there. And it was like a Wednesday afternoon. It was like not the full pageantry of a Sunday, but nonetheless, they had an organ player who was warming up and just improvising prior to Mass. And I just sat there in this sort of Neo-Byzantine cathedral, which is like nothing like any building where I live, right? Like Western Canada didn't really develop until after the war years. And so if we were going to build nice architecture, it was going to be modernist, right? So to sit rather in this incredible building and to listen to this person just hammering on the keys was like, I remember sitting there thinking, this is more intense than any of the most technical heavy metal that I enjoy, right? Like it has both the intensity and the virtuosity all combined. And he's not even playing a song right now. He's just warming up, right? He's just doing his scales. And I was like, this is amazing. And it's beautiful, right? This was the thing that was lacking from the stuff. Like the stuff that I listened to had skill, it had merit in many respects, and it was intense and it brought something out of me. And I'm a very melancholic personality, so I need things to kind of wake me up. This had all of that, but it was also beautiful. And for whatever reason, I was able to recognize it. I wasn't repulsed by it the way that some other people are, or at least they think it's boring or whatever, right?
Or too loud.
Maybe, yeah, sure. Or
whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And then they had a beautiful cantor singing throughout the Mass. And I was half awake because I was jet lagged, but I remember just sort of sitting in my chair, kind of like bobbing my head, trying to stay awake, thinking like, this is a beautiful, beautiful experience of the faith. It was the musification of our faith. Like if you could translate what it is that we believe and turn it into music, praise and worship isn't that. Praise and worship is the musification of a different culture, but the polyphony and the singing and the organ, this was this was the musification of this thing that I had adopted, and I couldn't have articulated it any other way than to just sit there and say, yes, this is it. This is beautiful.
That is beautiful. And I love that you say the musification, it's hard to say, of the faith, because it does feel that way. And especially when you're sitting in a church that's beautiful and ornate and old, it's kind of like, Victor Hugo, I think did The Hunchback of Notre Dame is supposed to be a novelization of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which is something that I think it's more than it is the story. But there's sort of this appropriateness to liturgical music when it's done properly, that, like you say, don't want to say anything too strong about praise and worship music, but it is.
Let me. I will. No, I'm just joking.
Well, it's made for something different, right? It's supposed, like, even the people who are proponents of it in a strong way tend to say that it is like a worldly thing that we're bringing in to try to bring people in from the world, and it can work for that. But it is kind of interesting that it's not necessarily the most appropriate, let's say, to what is actually happening during the liturgy.
It's the direction of, like, culture proceeds from creed, I would say, right? Culture is the embodiment of creed, right? And so what's the embodiment of the Catholic creed? Well, we know what that looks like. Christendom produced it for us. There was this flourishing and this blooming from within that gave us things like Gregorian chant and polyphony and eventually classical music and Gothic architecture, right? Like, Gothic architecture wasn't appropriated from somewhere else. Like, that's entirely unique to Christianity, as is Gregorian chant, right? And so, do they fit with Christian? Well, absolutely. They're almost inseparable, right? Was praise and worship the embodiment of our creed? No, it's the embodiment of a different creed, the creed of consumerism, frankly, right? Like, it's the consumer music industry that produced rock and roll because of the traits that it had that made it something that could be mass produced and very sellable, right? And that's what it was. And so we're saying, well, people like this, and so let's appropriate it and shoehorn it into ours. But it's sort of like, the analogy I often use is, it's sort of like trying to use someone else's words to communicate your own thoughts. There's going to be this incompatibility there that just doesn't work, right? And I think that's a lesson we're learning a really, really hard way right now in the church, because our culture is meant to evangelize, but we've set it aside and tried to appropriate another culture and try to use that to evangelize. And people look at it and think, well, it's inauthentic at best. At worst, it's just kind of this weird Frankenstein's monster that doesn't work at all.
Yes. Well, just to take your point, though, I think Chesterton's words work for me all the time.
Yes. Absolutely.
I could use his phrases at any time.
There's also kind of a connection and a through line there too, though, that Chesterton, as we've already noted, isn't necessarily as readily approachable, let's say, as other authors all the time. But I think his advice would be to sort of overlook that or to look through that and question the relevance, really, because Homer's not necessarily approachable. Right. Shakespeare's not approachable. Something worth reading, and his own adage comes to light. The thing worth doing is worth doing badly. There is a sense in which, even if you're going to read Chesterton badly, even if you're going to read Chesterton frustratedly and not understand what he's saying, it's still something that draws you out of yourself, from your own preferences, and challenges you. And excuse me, allergies are terrible today. Something that challenges you, something that helps you grow, is in the end, I think, a much more worthwhile endeavor, rather than appropriating something to ourselves in the way that I just saw an ad on social media recently for some new Shakespeare production where the characters appear to be dressed in some sort of Teletubby type costumes. It's very strange. And it said Shakespeare, and then I was like, the image doesn't fit the words here. There's something going on, but it sure enough is some sort of attempted Shakespeare production. And I think that, when we take those things and make them fit our needs, right, then we're falling into that trap that Chesterton and so many others have warned against, right? He says,
Yes.
I do not want a church that is right where I am right. I want a church that is right where I am wrong.
Yeah.
I want the church to be the thing that calls me out of myself,
right,
and calls me to challenge, to deepen my even things like my aesthetic preferences and tastes. So
yeah. Well, and he hammers that into us a bit, I think, in Orthodoxy, where he's talking about like the contrast between the insane man and the sane man, right? The insane man is the one who thinks he's got everything figured out. He's got this sort of finite little cosmos where he's got an answer to every question. But in so doing, he thinks he also knows all he needs to know about every single person he encounters on the street, and therefore has no curiosity about them. There's no adventure to life because you're locked in this little world where you have all the answers. But if you know all the answers, then there's nothing left to discover, right? Whereas the sane man is more carefree and is content with the mystical, is content with the mystery of the world, because the mystery is what's constantly drawing him out of himself and simultaneously giving him this sense of contentment that it's okay that you don't understand everything. You don't have to control everything. And that carefree attitude is what preserves his sanity in the process.
Beautiful kind of self-portrait of Chesterton too.
Yeah,
that was just his personality. I may not get it, but it's wonderful, and I will enter into it and be grateful for it. So
that is one thing that stuck with me in my first reading of Orthodoxy, because I'm the kind of person, and I know this genetically because my kin are this way as well, wherein I'm very susceptible to the kind of lunacy he describes in those opening chapters of Orthodoxy, and this was the reason I was reading Orthodoxy, and the reason I was reading C.S. Lewis is because the next time one of my friends or a family member comes at me with some argument, I'm going to let him have it with all my apologetics that I've memorized, right? I'm creating this tiny little world for myself. And the beauty of this one creed, had it been anything else, had it been Nietzsche or socialism or stoicism or anything else, I would have boxed myself in. But but the fact that I had turned to C.S. Lewis and then eventually G.K. Chesterton is these guys were saying, don't do that. Like, pride is the ultimate sin. You need to expand your world. You need to relax. You need to be okay with the fact that you don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that really saved me, again, after I had already, been rescued by Christ himself.
Beautiful. I've recently myself come to the realization that sometimes you can, use your apologetic strength, and sometimes you just go away and pray for people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah,
and that's effective and wonderful, and we should recognize that. Yeah, but no, it's beautiful. Joe, you thoughtful.
Well, a lot to meditate upon there. I think just especially in the modern era. Contemporary, let's say, what's going on in the world right now. You see so many of examples of Chesterton's quintessential madman, the monomaniac, trapped in the small, comfortable prison of one idea. And then contrast that with what he says about the church, which is that when the convert is finally at last looking at the church, he's like peering through the keyhole or a little leper's window. The way seems narrow. And then he says when he comes in, he realizes the church is larger inside than it is outside. And that's the perfect antidote to the small prison of a single idea. Yeah. And just so much. And I would have you, perhaps, Brian, speak to this because of your experience. I think that we see so much of this tendency in the atomization, the polarization, the vitriol of the online discourse, the way in which people can be just constantly sniping at one another and constantly forming ranks into seemingly ever decreasing small little cadres of in-group versus out-groups to no end. And maybe speak to just what advice would you have, or maybe what insight do you take from Chesterton or anywhere else that would help us navigate such climate where that tendency does seem to be all too prevalent?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me as it relates to Chesterton is that probably his greatest greatest rhetorical tool was his friendliness. And I don't just mean his affability, but his sincere desire to be friends with the people that he was interacting with. You know, he was famous for being friends with George Bernard Shaw, I believe. Also, even just the way that he would, even if he never did get to interact personally with the people that he describes in a book like Heretics, right? So Heretics is a book in which each chapter he's addressing a particular current of thought and usually a personality behind that current of thought, right? And whether it's like someone like H.G. Wells, for example. And the way he does it is like the first third of the chapter is he just can't say enough nice things about the person, about how capable a thinker and a writer they are and how much he admires them for all of these things. And then he gently sort of steers it and says, you know, but here's this little thing. And he does this very playfully, right? Like the way a friend would sort of tease another friend who believes something differently than they do, right? And we've really lost that. We don't seem to be wanting to win those arguments in order to win souls. We seem to be wanting to win those arguments because the argument is the end, not the person on the other side of that argument, right? And that's what social media seems to have done to us. And it's that sort of sense of tribalism that is, I mean, we could dissect why social media does this, but let's suffice to say that it does do this for now, and that insofar as it does do this, and insofar as we notice it doing this to ourselves, if we're Christians and if we care about the souls on the other end, and we find ourselves falling into this pattern, then maybe backing away from social media would be a healthy thing to do. And we rationalize this by saying, well, social media is our means to evangelization. But again, if it's boxing us into this sort of this funnel of tribalism, then we have to admit that and back away a little bit, I think. The other thing that I love about Chesterton, sorry, Grettelyn.
No, go ahead, please.
Is that he approaches the tribalistic discourse tends to rely on slogans, right? Like just the most superficial portrayal of, let's say, an ideology, or if we want to be more generous, just a creed or a system of belief, right? But you know, you interact with people online, and they tend to just immediately fall into their script, right? And it's obvious that if people are doing that, they're not really thinking critically. They're not thinking their own thoughts. They're thinking somebody else's thoughts, and then they're just, you know, verbalizing it. And this is true across the board. Like Christians are guilty of this, non-Christians, atheists, Protestants, Catholics, etc. But one of the things I love about Chesterton is that he addresses timeless debates, but he does it in such a way where you don't even realize that's the debate that we're having right now, right? Because he is that apostle of common sense. Like he's not relying on, oh, Locke framed the argument this way, therefore here's the counter argument, or here's how St. Thomas Aquinas would argue. Like he doesn't really do that. He does have that knowledge, but he's approaching it almost like he's this innocent, like, sojourner who's just happened into a world in which all of this polarization exists, and he's completely unfamiliar with all of it. And he's just like sort of like, well, you know, if you think about it this way, and he uses language that is completely unfamiliar, and it sort of ruptures all the sloganeering, right? And that's not easy to do. Obviously, I'm not saying this is what we should all do. It would be amazing if we could, obviously, but what I think it does demonstrate is that he's not falling prey to that temptation to just rely on the slogans, right? He's really thinking through these concerns, and he's listening to the other side and saying, okay, well, you know, if you believe this, here's what the implications are. And he does it in a conversational way, right? And you know, if I can steer the conversation back to the question of, you know, it's a lot of people struggle with Chesterton. I think part of the reason is, like, I started reading Chesterton with the expectation that he was going to equip me. It's study time, right? I always associated books with work, right? Not leisure, but like, it's time for me to study. I have to do work, right? So I'm going to open up Mere Christianity, or I'm going to open up The Problem of Pain, and I got work to do. And it was intensive, and it was like, oh, I need to take a break from my reading now, right? And what's great about C.S. Lewis is that for the kind of person who wants to do that intensive study, he's got answer, argument, answer, right? And thank God for that. That's we need that. But Chesterton doesn't do that at all. He sits down. He's got a pipe in his hand, maybe a bourbon. I don't know what he drank, but it's sort of like, get ready for a leisurely conversation with a friend who's way smarter than you, right? And then maybe if you're lucky, he'll rub off on you. And frankly, if I think about the greatest strides I've took intellectually or spiritually, it's because of a friend. It's not because of a book I read necessarily, right? It's because they knew something that I didn't know, and we were having a conversation about it. And I was like, oh, wow, you just opened up a whole new horizon for me. And now I'm going to take an interest in this, right? That's what reading Chesterton is like. It's not work. It's got to be leisure, and you have to do it leisurely. You have to be prepared for that kind of a conversation. And if it helps, I didn't know about this when I first started reading him, but it wasn't until I had gone back and listened to some of the books I had read and thought, this makes way more sense in terms of pacing, because he dictated his books a lot of the time,
yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And he dictated at the speed of conversation, the way he would have a conversation, I think. And so when you listen to the books, it's all they just sort of fall into this rhythm that is way more fitting, I find, a lot of the time. And it feels more like a friendly conversation with a wise older sibling or uncle who you really are just sitting on the leather lounge chairs with and having a great conversation. Or more so, he's imparting his wisdom, right? But I often find myself sort of giggling or talking back whenever I'll go for a walk and I'll listen to one of his books. And that's the kind of interplay that he inspires, I think. So to try to summarize all of that, like truly think about these things and do it conversationally with your interlocutors or the other creeds or the avatars of those creeds that you encounter on social media. Try to have a conversation with them before you actually interact with them and try to see their humanity in that.
Beautiful. Yeah, I don't know where it was, but recently it was probably on YouTube. Somebody was advising when you evangelize to really try to get to know the person, show them that you're interested in them. Ask them questions that are actually, like, oh, well, why do you think, that the Chi River flows through the world? Like, I've had this conversation for real.
Yeah,
but try to actually be interested, and you may have a better chance of touching somebody's heart. And I think Chesterton was just phenomenal at that. That's like you said, he had he was friends with H.G. Wells. He was friends with George Bernard Shaw. He was, they went to his house for dinner. Like, it wasn't just like they were, like, he was really friends with these people.
Yeah.
And that was beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And it comes through in his writing. Like, he treats them like real human beings rather than just avatars of some ideology.
Yep. And great advice for meeting Chesterton. I think it's a friendship. We say that all the time here on the podcast. It's a long-term friendship. And if you're willing to commit, you're going to have a really great friend at the end of it in Chesterton.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah. And that's why people have so much affection for him, because he's not just an author I pull off the shelf. He's part of the communion of saints that I interact with from time to time. Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us. I think this is a great place to wrap things up.
Sure.
Any final thoughts before that was a really good final thought, but
I don't know what
thoughts?
more I could say. I'd probably cap it there. I recently reread The Ball and the Cross for the first time, and that was one of the first books I had read by him. And I haven't read all of his stuff, but from what I have read, if you incline more to the fiction material, or you incline more to the nonfiction or the apologetics, The Ball and the Cross kind of meets you in the middle of the way, right? Like, so it's got meaty conversations within it. It's fun. It's hilarious in a lot of places. The characters have, there's a lot of different characters that you encounter along the way, but there's going to be something for everybody in there, I think, to some degree. And it is a vivid portrait of his temperament and his sensibilities and his good humor. And it's short. So if people are looking for a book to start with, I would recommend that one. And for some reason, that one doesn't seem to be well known by a lot of people who get introduced to Chesterton. So The Ball and the Cross, it's pretty fun.
It's a great one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been excellent. And maybe we can have you on again sometime. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
And thank you, Joe, as always. Great fun.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I just want to take one opportunity to invite everybody who's listening or watching to consider coming to our conference in Philadelphia in July. It's a great place to meet other people who love Chesterton, to have these great conversations. You'll hear some good talks too, but it's mostly the conversations, the friendship, all the things. Come and be with us and enjoy one of our best friends, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you so much, and God bless.